Okay, well, we'll let David get a seat over there. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome again, I think for most of you again, to the Atlantic Council. I'm Dick Morningstar. I'm the founding director and the chairman of the Global Energy Center, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all here for a conversation about power sector transition in the United States and in Germany. It's an area that I've been very interested in since I came here 2 years ago, and we've always wanted to do a program on it, and here we are today. I think it's a very important and timely topic. The power sector is rapidly evolving on both sides of the Atlantic as technology advances and patterns of energy consumption shift. And this is producing diverse options for our energy mix and for low-carbon solutions capable of addressing climate change issues. In the United States and Germany provide different examples for how to approach this transition. And in this context, it's important to compare the successes and challenges that both countries have faced in order to make recommendations for future action, both in the United States and Germany, but also worldwide. And so this is an opportunity to explore the emerging future of this critical part of our societies. This morning, we actually launched an issue brief on this subject, written by Tom Cunningham, the Global Energy Center's Deputy Director, entitled Energiewende. I'm pronouncing it right?
I think so. Let's look at the expert.
From Germany's past to Europe's future, which discusses Germany's energy transition from a U.S. perspective. I might add that this is Tom's swan song here, that it is with great moroseness that I tell you that he will be leaving to go work for Statoil in about 10 days to be their director for international affairs here in Washington. And Tom has done a great job here. It's one of these offers he couldn't refuse, even though I've been calling him Benedict Arnold ever since he told me about it.
It just makes you want to stay.
Right. But this afternoon, we're also delighted to have experts from both sides of the Atlantic who can speak to the power sector transition taking place in the U.S. and Germany, as well as the innovative approaches utilized and unique challenges ahead. So on the U.S. side, we're pleased to welcome John Banks, who's at the end, who's an adjunct professor and visiting scholar at Johns Hopkins, actually at SAIS, right?
Correct.
Part of Johns Hopkins, who teaches a course on global electricity markets, and he's also a non-resident senior fellow in the Energy Security and Climate Initiative at the Brookings Institution, where he's worked on research dealing with nuclear power, the transition of the electricity sector in Germany and Japan, and electricity access in emerging markets, among many other topics. And we also welcome Ann Hoskins, who is the Chief Policy Officer at Sunrun in California. Sun in California, I guess, goes together. The largest dedicated solar company in the United States. And prior to that, Ann served on the Maryland Public Service Commission and the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners Board of Directors, and previously has been a visiting research scholar at Princeton, where she researched the valuation of distributed energy. And from Germany, we are very pleased to welcome Hans Wilhelm Schiffer, the executive chair of the World Energy Resources Program of the World Energy Council in London. And Mr. Herr Schiffer spent more than 20 years working for the RWE Group in Essen, Germany, where he held many positions, most recently having served as head of RWE's General Economic Policy and Science Department until 2014. He continues to consult with RWE on issues concerning international energy policy and is a visiting lecturer on energy economics in the Mineral Research strike that, mineral resource engineering master's program at RWTH Aachen University. I might say I spent, in my days as a special envoy on energy, I spent a lot of time with many of your colleagues at RWE when talking about the Nabucco pipeline, such as it was. But we would also like to remind everyone that today's discussion is on the record and it is streaming live. And so please join the conversation on Twitter at AC Global Energy, and don't forget to hashtag AC Energy. So I'll now give the floor to my present but almost not deputy, Tom Cunningham, to moderate the conversation as we consider these issues. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, boss. Thanks, almost not boss. Yeah, I will be sitting.
You're counting the moments.
This is going to be a 5-minute show. I'm leaving. No. So thank you all for coming. I'm really excited. I've been looking at German energy issues for a long time at the State Department and here, and coming from doing my graduate work on German and European studies at Georgetown. It's really exciting to look at these issues. And Laura here from Exelon and I were talking about, well, what's going on with this Energiewende? Why is it doing things that seem so confounding? Why does it remain so popular? How is it pushing so many renewables onto the grid? What's going on with the utilities? These sorts of questions. So coming from that, I went and wrote a paper on the issue, which is kind of a real page turner. Emily Sandys, a former student of mine, she's here, helped with the editing and research of it. Hope you like it. So this conversation, though, is really to try to do a little comparison between the US and German approaches in their power sector. Bringing in renewables, what has that meant? What are some of the lessons learned? Not just lessons learned on each side of the Atlantic, but also, hopefully, are there lessons we can apply beyond the transatlantic space? We're doing some work at the Atlantic Council on power sector transformation in developing countries. Bob Eichord, a noted energy expert and former diplomat, has been doing a lot of work on that and doing that with us. So there's a lot of reasons why there's interest in this in the context of the new election here, upcoming elections in Germany, how strategic is the energy sector, and these designs have implications. So we've got an expert on Germany, an expert on the United States from the corporate and regulatory perspective, and John Banks, who's kind of like me, an all-around guy, and he and I are going to, so this, we'll start with a presentation by Hans Wilhelm on the German context. We'll ask Anne if you can speak a little bit about the US context. And then John will bring some thoughts in to look at similarities and differences. And then we'll go after with the hardest, best questions we all can think of. So without further ado, the floor is yours. And feel free if you want to stand and walk around while you present, or stay seated, as you like.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present here on the German Energiewende. First of all, I would like to say the energy supply in Germany is very different from the situation in the United States. We cover more than 90% of our oil, gas, and hard coal needs by imports. And we are phasing, as you know, nuclear energy completely out by 2022. The only energy resources we have got are lignite and renewable energies. Lignite is a competitive energy resource in Germany. Renewable energies are mostly not competitive and are dependent on subsidies. The US will probably be a net exporter within the upcoming 10 years. That's what I've learned from the Annual Energy Outlook 2017. That is really a big difference between Germany and the United States. It doesn't. Okay.
Oh. I think you're holding it backwards, upside down. So
yeah, upside down.
There you go.
Yeah.
Voila. There you go.
Okay, this is Germany, and as you can see, there's only lignite and not much production of oil and gas, and so we are very dependent on energy imports, and that is a very different situation compared to the United States. Another point is 1/4 of German total energy needs is covered by imports from Russia, the number one supplier of gas, of oil, and of hard coal. And it's followed by countries like Norway, Netherlands, United Kingdom, Kazakhstan, but also the United States are an important supplier for hard coal to Germany. The German energy mix differs from the energy mix in the United States. As you can see, coal, in particular lignite, has a higher share compared to the United States. The share of coal is approximately 40% in Germany, and it's now 30% in the United States. The share of the share of gas in power generation is less compared to the United States. The main reason is gas is much more expensive in Germany, in Europe, compared to the United States, and so coal is more competitive in comparison to gas. Other differences are nuclear energy has a lower share because of the phasing out of nuclear energy. We had a share of 26% some years ago, but now it's 13%, and in 2023 it will be 0. And a last difference in the energy mix is that the share of renewable energies is 30% in power generation in Germany and 15% in the United States. Besides these figures, other differences are Germany has 9 neighbor countries, and these neighbor countries are connected with the German system. The electrical system of Germany is connected with 9 neighbor countries we have got. And the third difference is the United States does not have a unifying energy policy. That is also mentioned in your paper. That is different from the German situation. In Germany, we have got a strong energy policy, a strong climate policy at federal level. And the main very ambitious targets in Germany in energy policy and climate policy are the target is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 90 to 95% by 2050 compared to 1990, halving the primary energy consumption and increasing the share of renewable energies up to 80% in 2015. And this project is based on the assumption that a highly industrialized society can be securely and competitively supplied by a system based predominantly on renewable energy. Of course, that has to still to be proved. The story started in the early 1990s, but the German Renewable Energy Sources Act implemented in 2000 truly kick-started the development of renewable energies in the power sector. This law provided for guaranteed feed-in tariffs for 20 years after commissioning the plant concerned. Grid operators are obliged to purchase the entire quantity of green electricity with priority. And the trading companies passed on the deficit feed-in tariff minus market price to customers by imposing a reallocation charge. And this has resulted in a tremendous increase in power generation based on the basis of wind and solar. You can see that in this slide, the capacity has increased from 12 gigawatt only in 2000 to more than 100 gigawatt in 2016. And if you compare the peak load we have got in Germany, the peak load is 85 gigawatt. So more than 100 gigawatt on the basis of renewables is really something. The share of renewable energies in total power consumption has increased 5-fold from 2000 to 2016. That is indicated by the ochre line. This happened as a consequence of the generous supporting scheme for renewable energies. And as you can see, the reallocation charge in total reached a level of more than 20 billion euros in 2016, and German customers have paid in total 150 billion euros for the supporting of renewable energies in the power sector. The support charge has exploded over the last few years and has reached a level of approximately 70 euros per megawatt hour. To illustrate the dimension of this charge, the charge is more than twice as high as the wholesale price for electricity. The problem for operators of conventional power plants is the wholesale price that reflects the revenues for the power plants for the conventional power plants has declined within the last decade, which is due to the so-called merit order effect. Merit order effect means the increase in renewable energies, the priority increase in renewable energies has shifted the supply curve, which is determined by the variable costs of the different power plants to the right. And that means that power plants with lower marginal costs are price setting now. In the past, mainly gas-fired power plants with higher variable costs were the price-setting ones, but now, after the increase of renewable energies, hard coal-fired power plants with lower marginal costs are the price-setting ones, and that means the revenues of the conventional power plants were reduced massively. And the second point is, in addition, conventional power plants are suffering from reduced operating hours as a consequence of the priority feed-in of renewables. And the third challenge is that conventional power plants have to provide for the flexibility needed to meet not only fluctuations in demand, but also fluctuations in the feed-in of renewable energies. Yeah, this slide is also quite impressive. It shows the situation on the 8th of May 2016. It was a sunny and windy day, and as you can see, in some hours of the day, nearly 100% of the total power consumption in Germany could be covered by renewable energies. That was the situation in spring, and that's a situation when the sun and the wind was in a very good position, and sun was shining and wind was blowing. But you can also have a situation like this one. It was in winter only a few weeks ago, and sun and wind hardly contributed to the power supply. And so 90% of the demand had to be covered by conventional power plants. This slide shows the difference between the capacity and the power generation. Peak load, as I said, is around 80 gigawatt. On cold working days, it can be up to 85 gigawatt. But we have got capacity, as you can see on the left side, of more than 200 gigawatt. Half of it is on the basis of renewable energies, and half of it is on the basis of conventional energies. And that means in high system that results in high system costs, of course. And the system costs are pushed further up by the necessary redispatch measures and the required extension of the grid system. We have to extend the high voltage grid system and the low voltage grid system as well, because the wind-based power generation mainly takes place in the northern part of Germany, but the power is needed in the southern part of Germany, and so that means we have to build high voltage power lines from the northern part to the southern part, but also the feed-in of solar PV needs an increase in the extension of the low voltage system. So 20-30 billions of euro are necessary in order to extend the grid system. And this results in electricity prices for industry, which are twice as high as in the United States. That's the average. And if you compare the household's price between Germany and the United States, you can see that the household prices in Germany are 3 times as high as the household prices in the United States. That means German customers have paid and are still paying for the learning curve the country has been going through for solar and PV and also for wind energy. But the good news is other countries are benefiting from it. There might be an opportunity in our session, and you announced it, to discuss the lessons learned from the development in Germany, and I look forward to answering your question. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hans. Hold your applause, please. No, I'm kidding.
No, that's good.
And upside down.
Oh, I've got it upside down too. Well, good afternoon. It's really a pleasure for me to be here with you. And as was described in my introduction, I'm currently serving as, actually, I guess we'll go to mine. Okay. I'm currently serving as Chief Policy Officer for a solar residential PV company called Sunrun. And so a lot of my comments are going to be focused on distributed PV, but I think we can get into some discussion about broader regulatory and energy issues on the domestic side in the United States. Very, very interesting for me to hear what we've heard so far. And I think I can start out by saying that the United States has indeed been a major beneficiary of the work and the investments that the people of Germany have made, particularly in PV. If you look at what's happening here, in the United States, it took 40 years to get to 1 million solar systems around the U.S., and we estimate it'll take 2 years to get the next million. We're in a time of tremendous growth and customer interest in solar energy, and particularly in distributed solar energy, which is why it's so exciting for me to be in this role that I just started a few months ago. And indeed, part of what has driven this have been the technological and cost improvements that we've seen in the solar panels and inverters and other technology that drives solar PV in particular. So if you look here, a little hard for me turning and seeing here, but anyway, you'll see that just the growth that we've seen. And this morning, actually, you may see it on Twitter or in some of the trade press today, the solar industry has come out with a number of statistics that have really demonstrated not just distributed solar PV, but also centralized solar. It's been a tremendous year of growth in the past year, and that the U.S. solar market has doubled its annual record, topping out at almost 14 gigawatts of solar PV. So just the level of growth, and also what we've seen in that has been the share of PV in terms of in solar energy of the overall energy mix of new generation that was invested in the last year was also the greatest share. So just a time of again tremendous economic growth, but also I would say public growth, which is one of the things that public support, which is one of the things I'd really like to talk about, because I think that's what's really interesting in what we've seen in Germany is even when you have had high levels of rates, you still have very high levels of customer interest and support for these clean technologies. So also, what's been really important in the United States has been the economic engine that solar is playing. And I think this is going to be particularly important now. We're in the new administration. Here in Washington, people are asking, what is this going to mean for renewable energy? And we feel quite confident that as a new leadership really looks at this and sees the amount of job growth that's happened, and not just in a very decentralized way, particularly with distributed solar, really bringing jobs to local communities, and the amount of growth that right now, this number actually is a little bit old. We had 209,000 Americans working in solar, but the statistics I saw today, which had another year of data, were 260,000. So it's something that is consistently growing as we're able to train new workers and give them these opportunities, and that has had a feedback loop also of expanding public support for solar energy. And I wish I could read my other slide there from here. No, that's okay. Oh, and this is the interesting part as well, and part of it is that the costs have dropped by more than 60% in the last 10 years. And again, I've got to give credit to other parts of the world, obviously, for some of the technology that's being developed in Asia, as well as the investments and the cost curve improvements that we've seen from the commitment in Germany and other parts of Europe. Let's see. So, in the United States, one of the reasons it's difficult to really compare the United States to Germany is that the United States are all very different, all 50 of the United States. Part of it is that we have a wide range of regulatory systems. The former chair of the FERC sitting in the front row. So we have a federal regulatory scheme, and then we have different state regulatory schemes. I had the honor of serving as a state regulator for 3 years in Maryland, which had competitive markets, which there is some comparison, I'd say, to the European system. But we have other parts of the country that are fully integrated. And so because of this, the incentives for utilities are very different. Whether you have markets that you might be able to bid some of this into and get other types of value exist in some parts of the country and not in others. The other complexity here, and it's quite interesting to me, I think just from a political perspective, is that all of the solar investments as well as the wind investments have benefited from either a federal investment tax credit or a federal production tax credit. And so as an overall matter, we have a strong federal policy in support of encouraging renewables development. We've also had some environmental policies at the federal level that have encouraged that. But what's been a challenge and makes my job, quite exciting is that when you get out to the state level, the states don't all have similar agreement or similar approaches on this. So you definitely have, so in the solar context, we have a 30% investment tax credit. But as you get to states, they've taken different approaches. And in some cases, states have, and I think I've got a nice chart on this. Let's look at renewable portfolio standards. That's been the predominant approach as compared to the feed-in tariffs in Europe. And you'll see that they've been quite popular. And actually, recently, there have been a number of states that have adopted legislation to expand their targets. And they go over a range of targets, some up to 50%, some lower, some are pure renewable. The latest, I'd say, fashion of this is to expand RECs to cover other things like nuclear in a couple of states where they're calling those clean energy standards. But the concept has been to try to have a competitive market essentially for this, where there would be a goal set and then there would be the ability for compliance by trading of these renewable credits. And it's actually been quite effective in encouraging renewables development. But one of the challenges in the United States is that every state defines renewables a little differently. Some states have carve-outs for solar. All of these different changes affect the value, and it's one of the reasons, again, that there's not continuity across the country. I want to actually talk a little bit before we get that, if I can go back to here. Some of the other approaches that we see, and one that's been really critical for the growth of distributed solar has been net metering, which has been our approach again versus a feed-in tariff, which was an approach that essentially is very customer focused in trying to keep it simple for customers. That essentially they will invest their capital or companies will invest and enter into leasing agreements, and customers can essentially just have their meter run backwards for any extra that they provide out to the grid and provide to their neighbors. This has been a very effective tool in terms of really democratizing solar and making it available to folks in an easy way. We're now moving into a new phase where we're facing some resistance. I think as this becomes more popular, as we have greater penetration, it is starting to challenge some of the utility business models, some of the incumbents who are in this market. And so now we're looking in some states, particularly ones that might have higher levels of penetration, of the need to see what is that next generation of policy that could work efficiently to ensure that customers who make this commitment, make the investment, can receive fair compensation for what they're doing to contributing to the energy mix. So that's something that's very active out in, we're probably involved in proceedings in 20 states in the coming year. And then the last thing I wanted to touch on here, which I will also get to on the technology side, is we're starting to see states engage in storage incentives and try to look at how are we going to add storage onto both centralized solar as well as wind, as well as distributed. what I wanted to touch on here is it goes back a little bit to this business model issue and also the picture of where we in the United States, some of the decisions that I think policymakers and regulators need to be making as we start to get technology, and we have, where customers are able to have solar plus storage, which means they're getting to the point where they're actually going to be able to decide, do they want to go off the grid? This is something that we don't encourage. You know, we at Sunrun, and I think most of the solar industry, really wants distributed solar to be viewed as a really critical element of the grid and a source of grid services. But what's happening as we're out in the states having these debates, and we're seeing, in some cases, utilities proposing things such as demand charges, fixed charges, changes in rates, which would have the effect of making it less beneficial to those customers who are generating this electricity to share that electricity with their neighbors and with their grid. As we start to get storage and it becomes more economical, as we're seeing, for instance, in Hawaii right now, then you start to get this issue of, you know, are we actually going to take a path, which we hope the country is going to take, of embracing these distributed resources and figuring out how to use them as part of the grid, or are we going to go the other path, which is much more everybody kind of protecting their own corner and losing the ability potentially of sharing those resources and really making our grid cleaner and more efficient. So we really see this as a very important time for energy policy and for state policymakers to hopefully step back and look at what our options are. And just for a moment, just to touch a little bit on our vision as Sunrun, as a distributed solar provider, we see the future as being much more than just having solar panels on your roof. We really see this as an opportunity to get into grid services on the grid, but also, you know, helping to power customers who want to invest in electric vehicles, helping to, you know, be involved in energy efficiency, home energy management systems. Where solar is right there on the edge of the grid, you're not going to have the types of line losses or some of the expenses and the large transmission investments that we've had to make in the past when we've had centralized resources. So we see this as the future and as an opportunity that is far more than the way it's sometimes portrayed as just an individual who has a solar panel on their roof and is getting a benefit. This is a real change in how we think the grid should be envisioned. And just as an example, and I had the fortune of going to Hawaii a few weeks ago to see this, Sunrun has started to install what we call our Brightbox product, where we use Tesla batteries, but there's other batteries also that we think in the future will be used, where now we have a situation in Hawaii where, in fact, because they did reach penetration levels, they have a rate system that is encouraging self-supply. So now we have customers who are demanding and willing to pay for solar panels and storage and having the ability to really, what's exciting is use that storage to shift their time of use. So they're able to generate, you know, when the sun is out and then save it and use it later more along with the peak. We're seeing similar kinds of opportunities in California, where we have time of use rates now for people who are on distributed solar and under net metering. And again, this is an opportunity to sort of use creative rate making and technology to enable customers to respond to challenges that are on the grid and provide services to the grid. And we think, in the end of the day, you know, help make our system cleaner and more efficient. So with that, I'll be happy to touch on sort of broader issues other than solar. But I think the solar experience is really instructive, one of how we can again, benefit from lessons and technological developments in other parts of the world. I guess actually the last thing I'll close on is I had the privilege when I was at NARUC of serving as the chair of the International Relations Committee. And NARUC, which is the Association of Regulatory Commissioners, has a really strong commitment to international partnerships. And they have a staff that focuses on this, that works with AID, works with the State Department, receives funding from them, and has worked very closely with countries in Africa under the Power Africa program, as well as in Eastern Europe, and countries that are trying to figure out how to manage and develop regulatory systems. So I think that there is a foundation for a strong relationship between U.S. regulation and European and international regulatory efforts. So I really appreciate your efforts to bring this together today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
No, that was great. And NARUC is doing a lot of interesting work in that International Relations Committee. There was that panel that I participated in on Sunday that looked at U.S. gas exports. What does that mean internationally? And what does the international gas market mean for domestic markets in the United States? So it is great to know that it's not just a localized issue. And it's challenging in the power sector to see the international issues when grids are off, by nature, local issues. John, you've done a lot of research on this at SAIS and at Brookings.
Right.
Can you draw some links together, look at some similarities, differences?
Sure. What a surprise question. So first, thank you, Tom, for...
You want a surprise question?
I know it's coming. Thank you, and thank you to Ambassador Morningstar and to the Atlantic Council for inviting me here today. It's a pleasure to join the discussion. So I thought in the introductory remarks, the short few minutes here, maybe and really pulling together some of the comments and maybe adding some others. First, provide a bit of an overarching context to this concept of a power sector transition, which was in the sort of description of this event, and then throw out a couple of comments on similarities and differences to kind of get the ball rolling, touching on a few things that have already been mentioned. So I think it's good to step back and sort of provide an overall context to this issue of the power sector transition. I think there's three major disruptors or trends that are affecting the power industry globally, including common to Germany and the United States. Policy, technology, and customers or customer engagement. And I think if you think about it this way, you can see some more clearly perhaps some of the differences and similarities. In policy, I think it's fair to say that across many power sectors, across different regions, you see policy initiatives to move away from fossil fuels, to lower carbon emissions, reduce GHGs, to promote renewables, essentially to move away from fossil fuels and to decarbonize. Now, obviously, there are many countries that won't be able to do this overnight or in the near term or medium term. They will be around for several decades, but clearly the policy trend and this disruptor is pushing the power sector and policymakers to implementing policies and initiatives to move away from fossil fuels. Second, in technology, and that's been touched on a little bit here, you're seeing major innovations and major cost declines in both utility scale renewables and in distributed energy resources. And DERs, or distributed energy resources, are rooftop solar PV, electric vehicles, storage, as we saw in the slide, and energy efficiency and demand response technologies. And we're all very familiar with the dramatic cost declines, for example, in wind and solar. And that has translated into greater deployment of these resources, both utility scale and distributed. In 2015, in the EU, 76% of all new capacity additions were wind and solar. In the same year, 67% of all new capacity additions were wind and solar in the United States. And then thirdly, customers or customer engagement. I think as part of a broader societal trend of the customerization of everything, we're seeing this also happen in the electric utility sector, where customers are demanding greater control and greater choice over their energy use and over products and services and their choice of products and services. So as prices come down and technologies get more affordable, there's more demand on the part of customers for these technologies and services, and utilities have to start paying more attention to the customer and treat them not just as ratepayers, but as differentiated customers. As one executive from a demand response company phrased it, utilities are transforming from the monopoly provider to the provider of choice. So these disruptors clearly are mutually reinforcing and interrelated, right? So as policy initiatives take hold, they help to push the deployment and the commercialization of technologies, driving down costs. As the costs come down, they're more affordable for customers. Customers adopt them more. Utilities have to pay attention to customers more and engage them more. And customers themselves, both from the household level to the corporate level, are demanding policy initiatives for clean energy and meeting environmental goals. So I think these disruptors are kind of broadly applicable across a power sector in transition globally and are clearly applicable in Germany and the US. Now, within these disruptors, there's clearly similarities and differences to bring it down now to the level of the two countries. One which has been touched on here, and I'll just make a few comments on, is in the policy arena. There's a very clear difference between the development and implementation of policy and the policy tools being used in the two countries. In our research and our conversations in Germany and with both proponents and skeptics of the Energiewende, I don't think there's any question that there is a remarkable degree of consensus across civil society in Germany and across the political spectrum on the overall objectives. Okay, so there is a broad acceptance of the need to address climate change, of the need to move away from fossil fuels, to not use nuclear, to not use CCS, but to use renewables principally, and efficiency and other measures. But there is a remarkable degree of consensus in building overarching national federal policy in Germany and balancing environmental security and economic goals. That is not the case in the US. I think you could argue from the 1970s and the oil price shocks in that decade, we have struggled really to establish a balance between economic and energy security and environmental objectives in energy policy. And today, obviously, we don't have a central overarching energy climate policy, but in fact, we have a mix of federal and state policies as Ann was enumerating. Just a couple of comments on what might account for that difference in the US. It is difficult to build consensus in the US, and I think for a number of different reasons, some of which have been touched on. Ann mentioned, and this is, I think, clearly the case, the sort of fragmented nature of the electric utility industry, right? The different ownership models, the different types of markets, the overlay of federal and state regulatory frameworks, I think makes for a more complex environment in building consensus. I think the resource endowment of the two countries also complicates the building of consensus policy. And clearly the hydrocarbon boom in the US and the shale boom in the US has complicated the building of that consensus. The role of the states is stronger. The debate over the appropriate role of government in energy policy is much more fierce in the United States than in Germany. I think you've had since the 1970s a real roiling debate in the US over what the appropriate role of government is in setting policy. Should it be more technology neutral or technology specific, or more market friendly versus more command and control, right? And we've gone back and forth and stop and start on various incentives and policies over the course of the last several decades. I think you also clearly have a stronger, more influential fossil fuel industry in the United States, which complicates the building of a consensus in energy policy. And finally, more recently, say in the last 10 years or so, very distinct from Germany, you have much more climate skepticism and denial, frankly, of the importance of climate change and existence of climate change. That does not really exist in a strong way in Germany, although with the rise of the AfD, the far-right party in Germany, which has expressed skepticism on climate change and called into question some of the policies that you've talked about, maybe that will change. But by and large, to date, there has been this remarkable consensus, I think, on the overall objectives in Germany, and I don't think that exists in the US. And then finally, just to throw out a similarity, I think, in the two countries. So as you add more utility scale renewables and distributed energy resources, you get some impacts on the system. As you add more intermittent resources, you will see some impacts and challenges that grid operators, policymakers, and the utility industry have to deal with. And the first is the emergence of flexibility as a key paradigm or challenge in the market. As you add more intermittent resources, the rest of your system has to accommodate that, and it has to become more flexible. You need more responsive load, and you need more responsive conventional generation to respond to that and to supplement that. And that is a challenge that confronts, I think, both grid operators in the US and policymakers in the US and in Germany. You have the rising importance of grids as you add more intermittent resources and distributed resources. So at the transmission level, you need to ensure that you have sufficient transmission to connect your remote renewables to demand. You need transmission to interconnect markets so that you can better balance, expand balancing areas, and better balance intermittent renewables. And at the distribution level, as Ann was touching on, you have a very large impact with the addition of all of these distributed energy resources coming online, connecting at the lower voltage levels, both in front of the meter and behind the meter. You've got significant challenges in the way the distribution grid used to be run. And the utilities have to look at how to integrate these intermittent renewables and run the distribution grid as a platform, how to price distributed energy resources, by location, by time. It's really putting pressure on the way the distribution grid has been run in the past. And finally, the addition of much more intermittent resources and distributed resources also puts pressure on the business model, on the way that the utilities have operated traditionally. Until recently, so when this this impact of more renewables and distributed resources happened, there was all this talk about, the utilities are dinosaurs, they won't be able to adapt, it's the death knell, the death spiral for utilities. But in the last several years, I've seen much more adaptive response from the utilities in both countries, right? There isn't talk about the changes being threats to the utilities, but the utilities starting to see them as opportunities and how they can take advantage of these transformative trends and disruptors going on. And with that, I will leave you with two quotes, short ones. One from Ann Pramaggiore, who's the CEO of ComEd in Illinois. She said, and this is in line with the business model impact, we need a power system that is cleaner, leaner, and ultra-reliable, as well as service that can respond to the clarion call of the digital age, customized, connected, and communal. And then Peter Terriam, who was the CEO of RWA, he's now the CEO of a spin-off from RWA, said a few years ago, my dream, my vision is that RWE will put solar panels on your roof, a battery in your shed, a heat pump in your cellar, and we will also manage this complex energy system for you. We want to be the holistic energy manager of the future. So I think this is, and since then, since he made that comment, RWA has split, and he is now CEO of Innogy, which took the renewables, grid, and retail business away from RWA and left the residual RWA with the conventional fossil fuel and nuclear plants. So I think that this overall impact that a power sector transition is having on the utilities is presenting the same challenges to both utilities in Germany and the United States, and we're seeing some of the same adaptive responses, broader responses, although there are some differences as well. So I'll finish there and
Thanks,
with those
John.
tidbits.
That's great. That tees up the questions I want to ask. And I'm going to just ask a few and then let the audience ask some questions. You've already had to learn how to eat Caesar salad on a paper plate in a teeny little chair. You deserve a reward. So always wanted to say that. So Hans Wilhelm, your presentation gave very objective, excellent data about the renewables transition inside Germany from the perspective, I think, of the World Energy Forum, or World Energy Council, right, where you're working. But maybe putting the old RWE hat back on, as John was saying, the utilities have had to, are now having, if you can't beat them, join them approach, right? So how successful has this transition in Germany been? Yes, they've deployed a lot of renewables, but coal remains a huge part of the energy supply. That's partly a reality of the fuel choice, but it's hard to incent gas to get back into the power sector in Germany. Also, utilities are holding the bag. I mean, John talks about how RWE has split off its fossil or conventional assets. Aon has done the same thing, and Aon's CEO of the new company that is now focusing on clean energy is also talking about delivery of services, thinking about things at the distribution level. But the base load is still necessary, as your slide from the winter snapshot reveals. But it looks like it's the state that's responsible for paying or for holding those assets, which are really expensive. So is there a way that this Energiewende going forward can do better? What happens to those utilities, or the utilities for which, what happens to all those assets that remain less and less profitable, but remain really important for grid stability?
First of all, I would like to say the system, the extension of the renewable energies was quite successful. The FIT system, the feed-in tariff system, was very effective, not necessarily efficient. A renewable energy promotion system, which is based on produce and forget, and we started with such a system, is not a system which you keep on a long-term basis. It's not a long-term solution, and it's only appropriate for the starting point. One lesson we learned is that the necessary extension of the grid system should go hand in hand with the expansion of the renewable-based generation plants. After we have experienced with the feed-in tariff systems, we now came up with a system that we do auctions. Tender systems can be seen as an adequate instrument in order to ensure that the dimension and the location of the investment are in line with policy targets and the power system requirements. As far as the conventional energy are concerned, I told about the suffering situation, the decreasing revenues, and in order to keep security of supply, we need an additional system, addition to the energy-only market. We need a capacity market for the conventional power plants in order to make sure that the conventional power plants are still operational, can still operate with profits. Otherwise, we cannot secure the supply in the future. Battery systems, storage systems are not on the way. We haven't got sufficient storage systems, and so we still need for decades the conventional power plants in order to compensate for the for the fluctuating feed-in of renewable energies. The companies like RWE or E.ON or Innogy are very much in line with the Energiewende. We want to promote the Energiewende. We invest in renewable energies, in solar PV panels, in wind energy. We're one of the most important offshore or wind energy investors. So we support really the Energiewende, and we want to make it to a successful to make it successful. But capacity market are necessary in order to provide the necessary backup for these fluctuating renewable energies.
Thanks. Anne, you're next. So from the perspective of a company that focuses on renewables, from that disruptor position that John talked about, this new administration's focus has been repeatedly on coal and oil and gas production, about increased production of these traditional energy sources. Is that focus incompatible with the market forces that have brought so much renewable energy onto the grid? Is this renewable energy deployment something that will happen regardless of that kind of federal level prioritization?
Sure, so thank you. Well, we really don't know what's exactly going to happen in the federal policies. We certainly are hopeful that, as I said, they're one of the core policies that's facilitated the development of solar and wind have been the renewable tax credits.
Right.
And at this point, the ITC was already looked at a couple of years ago and was given an extension period down to 2021, and so, or 2022, one of those years. So, our expectation is that as policymakers turn to this issue and look at it and they compare the jobs that have been created, the efficiency of the systems and just the technological improvements, that has already been looked at, has been reformed, and that we'll continue on with that. But I think sort of from a broader picture, so much of the activity really is at the state level, and that's really where I think it's going to be, continuing to be very important for all of us to engage with utilities who are regulated by the states, with legislatures and with regulators, and just to see that, again, at the end of the day, if you're looking at the need, some of the issues that really drive state regulators, one of the key ones are always reliability, safety, affordability. And I think the reliability issue is going to become, increasingly important because we are indeed experiencing impacts of climate change. And certainly in some parts of the country, There is a strong desire to make sure that we have a diversified energy system, and this is a source of essentially private capital that is helping to provide diverse energy sources, which are really consistent with officials who are concerned about reliability and security. And the other thing I'll note is, after the election, we did some polling about where the public is on this, and there's tremendous support for solar energy across the political spectrum. Something like 85%. Look at my staff there, but I'm pretty sure that was the number. And when you go into different states, one of the exciting parts about my job is that people are very different, obviously, but in different states you have a lot of different political cultures. And one of the strongest groups of proponents for distributed energy are actually folks who have a very strong independent streak and want to have greater control over their electricity and over essential supplies. And so we find in states that you may otherwise think of perhaps not traditionally interested in the environmental elements of this or the climate change issue are very strongly interested in trying to make sure that they have some ability to have input into how their electricity is produced and that they have something they can count on. So I would say it's going to be a really interesting time, and that we are going to be out, working with policymakers of all different stripes to help them understand, how these new sources of electricity are really, really important for our economy.
John, you want to jump in?
So on this question of different policy approaches and how customers are responding, so I think that rooftop solar PV has kind of served as a gateway drug for other distributed energy resources in both countries, right? So when we were in Germany,
that makes you a pusher, Ann.
One of the things we discussed was the feed-in tariff and how generous it was and how it has really spurred this deployment of renewable energy. But it's interesting that customers don't see themselves as being subsidized to put rooftop solar PV on their roofs. They see themselves as investors. And this has had this kind of circular logic where, they, for environmental reasons, but also for economic reasons, for the benefit that they get from the feed-in tariff, I'm talking about historically since 2000, they see themselves as investors. They're invested. They now constitute a renewable constituency, and they want more.
Yeah.
And that's why there's not that much pushback, really, at the household level, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, against higher feed-in tariffs, and now they're moving to market premium and auction, so it's different. But maybe something similar has happened, not because of a feed-in tariff, but in the US that jives with what you're saying, which is people now see that some of these distributed resources, particularly rooftop solar as the gateway drug, as affordable. They can take control of their own energy. They have this independent streak, or they're doing it for environmental reasons. It's opened the gates to other energy choices, other technologies that are available to them.
Yeah.
And I think that's fairly similar phenomenon, although perhaps the drivers and how it happened was slightly different.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, in Germany, there's a top-down policy that there's public interest in a certain outcome, right, which is a denuclearized, decarbonized energy grid. Other issues, exactly how to get to it, I think there's a lot of trust or faith or allow the government to identify that. A lot of challenges at the utility level to actually make that happen. It sounds like, though, at the U.S., there isn't such a federal top-down signal or any appetite for one. So therefore, companies like yours have to sell that product, and it is many different kinds of products and services that you sell. Well, it's kind of one thing, right? Yeah. But you create a lot of interesting tailored business models. So you show flexibility to show the different services it creates.
If I could just add to that,
Sure.
One of the issues which we may get into around the sort of the role of the utility, and I think one of the quotes you had, I think on that German company, was they wanted to control it all. That's one of the debates that we're going to be facing increasingly in the United States is which kind of entities do you want to be, moving this forward and actually, working with customers to provide these services. And, my view, I actually spent 7 years at a utility before I was a regulator. And, my experience, here at Sunrun is that, there's tremendous benefit from taking advantage of competition. And Sunrun is driven every single day to try to find out how we're going to be able to reach those customers, how we're going to get the cost down, how we're going to drive down some of these soft costs, which interestingly also I'd love to hear more about how Germany has done that, because the soft costs of like actually permitting and the sales process and all the customer acquisition are much lower in Germany and other parts of Europe than we've achieved yet. But there is a driving need to do that as we compete with other solar companies. And I think just a very, customer focused, because you need to be customer focused because we need to sell the services in order to go forward. And so my hope is that there's a way that we'll be able to find a path forward where utilities will really get to focus on where they have the comparative advantage, which is really managing that grid and doing what we need to do to upgrade the grid so that we are going to be able to have these two-way flows of electricity, and we are going to be able to use these resources to reinforce that, sort of along the models like the Rio model in the UK and the efforts that New York is looking at with the REV program, that California is starting to look at, and to try to see where do we really have the advantages. Because while utilities certainly have strong relationships with their customers and generally thought of highly from their customers, that is not in their DNA to be going out and knocking on doors and going to Costco like we do, to actually engage with customers, to offer new services, and to have that competitive pressure to figure out, what are we going to do next? How are we going to get that solar and storage? And how are we then going to get into the home services? So, our hope is we're really going to be able to find a path forward, to really benefit, take advantage of where we each have our strengths.
Thanks.
I agree completely with your excellent analysis on the situation. One important point is also that we have got 1.5 billion households who invested in solar panels. And of course, there's now an interest in keeping this supporting scheme running, because you receive nice margin in this investments. I also did it. I did the same investment for financial reasons, not so much for environmental reasons, I must confess. And also in the case of wind energy, there's the farmers and other investors who benefit from this investment, and now you have a big push in favor of renewable energies because of these interested people, 1.5 to 2 million people out of 80 million people at least, who have an interest to keep this system. And another problem which also arises, and which is also being discussed, is that means a reallocation of money from poorer people to richer people, because the richer people are in the position to invest, the poorer people pay the bill. And that has also caused to the situation that we have to discuss about electricity tariffs, because the people who invested in solar panels on the roof of their houses don't pay so much for the tariffs, and the others, people who are not in the position to do that,
Still have to pay.
have to spend more money for the grid fees. That is also a discussion we have got in Germany.
Well, let's go to questions from the audience. I know we've got a few interested people. We've got a microphone runner, this gentleman here, and we'll start with Branko Terzic, who is our plant. We planted him here. He's a senior fellow with the Global Energy Center, former chairman of the FERC.
Thank you. I was a state commissioner as well, but I'm speaking as a German-born person.
Hiya.
And my question has to do with nuclear power. You mentioned that Germany's nuclear plants would be closed in a relatively short period. I'm wondering if the renewables do not grow as fast between now and 2024, 2025. Would Germany policymakers reconsider lengthening the time they keep the nukes for greenhouse gas reasons?
I would say definitely not. There's no political party in Germany who is in favor of extending the use of nuclear power plants. You mentioned the AfD, but I don't take this party serious. But all the other parties,
You don't want to, or you don't?
the Conservative Party, the Liberals, the Social Democrats, the Green Party, and the majority of the population is in favor of phasing out nuclear energy. And I would say if one party would dare, except the AfD, that's a different situation, but if one of the big parties would dare to say we come back to nuclear energy and to extend again, after we had 2 U-turns in the case of nuclear energy, that would be, they would lose millions of voters, and that would be not advisable to, and all parties know that. And so now I would say definitely we never will come back to an extension of nuclear power plants, and we are not going to build any nuclear power plants in the future. And you are right, we are in the position, of course, the increase of renewable energies is just can compensate the reduction in the nuclear power plant generation. And that means that in 2030, more or less the same number of power generation has been provided by fossil fuels compared to the situation today and compared to the situation even 20, 30 years ago. And that means it's quite hard, of course, to reduce CO2 emissions anymore, because the first step until 2022 is to compensate the CO2-free nuclear power plants by renewable energies, and that makes it very difficult to achieve the ambitious targets. And I don't know, and I don't believe that we are able to achieve the 2020 target. 2020 target is reducing the greenhouse gas emissions by 40% compared to the level in 1990. By 2016, we have achieved 27.5%. That means within the next 4 years, we had to achieve another 12.5 percentage points reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, and I think that is not feasible. And there is another point I would like to come back to your question. Is it necessary to get more gas into the German system? And my answer would be in this case also, no, I don't see the reason to get more gas into the German system. We have got an emission trading scheme, a CO2 emission trading scheme on the European level. There's a cap on CO2 emissions in the European system. And if any government actions would lead to a reduction of coal by increasing gas, that would even mean that the total greenhouse gas emissions would increase, because we had to import more gas from Russia. Russia is the only supplier.
Because of the emissions intensity of Russian gas production?
Yeah, and because of the emission intensity of gas production and transport of Russian gas, and because of the fact that the emissions which we get in the production fields in Russia and during transport, which are not covered by the European emission trading scheme, the emissions would even increase instead of decrease if we are phasing out coal and increase the share of gas. And so I don't see any political reason to do something to replace coal by gas. That is in Germany, as you know, a big discussion, especially the Green Party. They try to replace coal by gas after nuclear energy is replaced. They now try to replace coal by gas, but that is only something of the Green Party. But it will be exciting.
It's a provocative point that you're making, and an important one, talking about the overall and this challenge about the European-wide carbon trading, but national renewables targets, sort of measured at the EU level. A lot of interesting balances, and you could also add in, I think Germany is getting rid of nuclear power, but still importing electricity from France, which is nuclear generated. Let's go to some more questions. Oh, hello. And when you're asked, please, you're next, sir. Please state your name and affiliation.
Sure. So I'm Lara Pierpoint, and I'm with Exelon. I'm part of the corporate strategy team there. I'm wondering if actually all three of you could speak a little bit more about the role energy efficiency is likely to play going forward. So particularly in Germany, I'm interested, I read actually with great interest in Tom's fantastic paper that while it's true that electricity rates are quite high for residential customers in Germany, the bills are actually relatively low compared to what we see in the US, in part because of very deep energy energy efficiency retrofits they've done. And I'm wondering if those were incentivized by the tariffs or if this is something that's sort of more endemic in German culture. But then particularly in both Germany and the United States, I'm curious about what the opportunities look like going forward. In the US, certainly energy efficiency is a reason why we're seeing low growth rates of electricity out in the future. But really to understand is anything going to change? Is there a huge opportunity there still to be tapped in both countries? Or are we likely to see other dynamics playing greater roles in shaping our energy mix?
Let me jump in real quick because it falls in the category of a sort of difference that I didn't mention beforehand, but as you alluded to, it's correct. And I may be off by a little bit on the numbers, but average German household consumption per year is 3,500 kilowatt hours. In the United States, it's over 10,000. Right. So the impact that a higher bill is going to have on a U.S. household on the levels that you saw in the Energiewende would be substantially more impactful than what you see on the average German household. So the level of efficiency and use per household matters a great deal, I think.
Germans see about double the costs, but are 3 times more efficient.
And interestingly, the percentage of disposable income spent on electricity has remained remarkably consistent in Germany throughout these increases in the EEG surcharge. It's ranged, I think, correct me again if I'm wrong, but somewhere around 2.5%. That's about the same of what it is in the United States.
Interesting. Well, I can answer that a little bit. So, energy efficiency is a policy that I think almost every utility commission in the country supports to some degree. And certainly in Maryland, I think Maryland is one of the leaders in terms of promoting different options. I think some of the challenges with energy efficiency that aren't always mentioned, though, is how do we really share those benefits with all ratepayers? We're getting to the point, I'd say, actually, where surcharges in some of the states on these are hitting $6, $7 a month, and challenges of getting those benefits to the lowest income customers. I mean, we hear a lot of talk about that in distributed solar, but it's a challenge across the board in terms of making sure when you have these social policies and policies for very important purposes, such as energy efficiency, that we find a good way to deliver those. And I know that's something that different states have looked for different approaches on that. One of the interesting things, opportunities that we have going forward, and if you think about the chart I had of where we're going with electrification, is that there's the opportunity for us to actually increase demand with electrification as customers start to look to things like electric vehicles, having the battery services, having the grid services. And I think through that, if you can combine that with energy efficiency standards on some of the appliances, other incentives for things like audits and the like, so that you're improving our efficiency and usage, but then also looking for ways to take these clean energy sources, such as the distributed energy, to fuel electric vehicles, solar-powered water heaters, all of those kind of things. There's a real opportunity for us to have an overall positive impact both on the economy and as well as on issues like the GHGs. So, I think this just, again, reinforces the need for, utilities and energy companies to be working with some of the competitive energy efficiency providers and other distributed energy resources to figure out, how we can move forward.
Those gains will emerge as we think more holistically about the role of electricity.
I think so.
And the kinds of services in transportation and elsewhere.
I would like to agree
Please.
that energy efficiency is the most important tool in order to reduce CO2 emissions. Renewable energies, increasing renewable energies is also, of course, very important. And I think the third tool is, we haven't discussed it, carbon capture and storage. Concerning carbon capture and storage, the United States and also Canada are much better than Germany. We are, after phasing out nuclear energy, after trying to phase out coal, at least by some parties, we also nearly phased out CCS, but I think is not a good decision, because all the studies prepared by the International Energy Agency, for example, show that we cannot achieve the ambitious targets targets without CCS. We need everything. It's not a question of either or. We need energy efficiency, we need an increased renewable energies, and we need carbon capture and storage. In Germany, energy efficiency is really a success story. We had an increase in the GDP by about 1/3 from 1990 to 2016, but the primary energy consumption even decreased. So very good success in energy efficiency. The houses are nicely insulated normally, especially in new houses, but also old houses. That is an advantage possibly to the United States. The cars need less fuel compared to most of the cars in the United States. I accept, of course, you have another style of living, and it's different, of course. But I would like to summarize in that way that energy efficiency is really an important tool and possibly the most important one.
We have time for a couple more questions. Sir, you in the front. Raise a hand if you still have a question. I'll scan. Okay, thank you.
I'm Steve Herman with Energy Capital Partners. Going back to Germany and your slide on the prices, on the prices to industry, I noticed that Germany, relative to most countries, especially the U.S., but even other European countries, the industrial price is much higher. To what extent has this penalized German industry in competing in world markets?
Good question.
Yeah.
Competitiveness.
It's a burden on the German industry, and it's not only the electricity prices, it's also the gas prices, which are much higher in Germany compared to the United States. And in your paper, you also mentioned that, for example, the chemical country BASF has invested in the United States because of high energy prices. It's surprising how much electricity these big companies in Germany is really industrialized country. About 50% of our electricity consumption is consumed by industry, and only 1/4 by households, and the other quarter by smaller, by the Mittelstand, by the smaller companies. One thing which we want to avoid, that investment is not going anymore to take place in Germany in energy-intensive industry, is that we exempted the energy-intensive industries from the high burdens of the Renewable Energy Act. The very intensive industries pay either nothing for reallocation charges on renewable energies, or only a very slow amount, just in order to keep the competitiveness of these industries, such as steel industry, chemical industry, aluminum industry, and that is very important. Otherwise, we would lose them, and we would get the investment to other countries.
Right. So that the German law for subsidizing renewables with the feed-in tariff exempted energy-intensive industries, which the European Commission had a competition enforcement investigation to see if that was fair for other European countries to see that benefit, and they allowed it to pass, which kind of shows the need in Europe to incorporate competitiveness for energy-intensive industry with any kind of electricity design. You had a question, I think, and then you have a question, sir. Then we'll try to get in the wings, if you don't mind. We might not have time for everyone.
Hi, my name is Anne, and I'm actually from Germany. I'm currently at the Climate Institute here in DC. So there was and the question is for you, Anne. There was a subcommittee hearing this morning on modernizing the grid, and several witnesses brought up the need for a national grid, and you were talking about these two paths that can be possibly taking the integrated grid versus grid defection. So I was wondering if a national grid, if that's even possible, could offer a solution between path 1 and path 2.
Right.
To have a more integrated grid.
Sure. I didn't hear what happened this morning at that hearing. I'm assuming they were focusing more on our transmission grid, which is generally, what is our high voltage, which is obviously very important as you look at things such as build out and access to wind and other renewables and even other baseload sources and utility scale solar. I think what I was talking about had more to do with our distribution grid, which is the grid that is operated really at a state-by-state level, and which really adds to the complexity. It would be a little hard for me, looking at Bronco too, to envision that ever being nationwide because we couldn't get everybody to agree. But I think what tends to happen in the United States, though, is we do have the benefit, because we have these 50 different laboratories, folks trying different regulatory approaches to figure out how best to integrate it, and then they tend to get adopted. So, in this case, the states to watch are California, New York, Massachusetts, a few others, but Minnesota right now. There's states that are really trying to look at ways to adapt the regulatory structure so that you could, enable utilities to continue to support and upgrade the grid, but at the same time not put undue burdens on these new technologies so that customers won't have the incentive to really share their resources and become part of an integrated grid. So I think it really is going to be more on a state-by-state basis, potentially with the exception that right now the FERC has opened a proceeding to look at how the wholesale markets might be able to incentivize distributed energy resources and storage. So that's another element that really is just going to add some more complexity to it. But I think we'll start to see potentially some regional approaches on some of this, but probably certainly not nationwide.
We've got 1 minute to go. So, sir, you have the last question.
Okay. Jeff Gibson from SAIS, actually, one of Professor Banks' students. Many of us are here today. So I'd like to ask you more about how Germany and the U.S. are successfully incentivizing energy efficiency, specifically deep, retrofits of existing building stock. I mean, in America, only 4% of our commercial building stock, it's 93 billion square feet, are even rated. And sure, we've got ratepayer-funded utility incentive programs. We've got an ESCO industry in both countries, but I don't think the penetration's really there. One interesting solution, Ann, you mentioned, was these building and home energy management systems, where you kind of take humans out of the equation, which isn't a bad idea, and have the grid, the buildings, the vehicles all talk to each other. So, what can we do better in both countries to incentivize energy efficiency? Thank you.
Quick responses from each.
Yeah, we have got regulations and incentives for increasing energy efficiency in buildings, and I think that worked quite well. Regulation for new houses really reduce the energy consumption, and the owners of new houses are also obliged to use renewable energies in their buildings. Of course, that increases the costs for the houses, and that is also a discussion on the other side. And we have got CO2 standards in the transport sector for cars on the basis of European regulation, and that of course leads also to more efficiency in the transport sector.
Thanks. Ann?
Yeah, just I think a quick thing, separate from what I'm involved in now, is there's been a very significant investment across the country in smart meters in a large number of states at this point, which I think the potential of those smart meters has been very underutilized and under-realized. There's a lot of data that's coming out. There's a lot of opportunity for empowering customers to use the information that's there to change their consumption. That can have an effect on either total overall use, but also changing the demand so that we might have less peaks and less need for some of the peakers that have very damaging environmental impacts. And so, as you mentioned, I think if you can find a way to also make this data available in a more accessible way to third-party providers, you're going to have their competitive interest spur a lot of creativity, as we're already seeing, whether it's the Nest thermostats or others, right, to be able to come up with use technologies to empower customers to be able to take greater control of their energy use. And I think that's really, really the next great opportunity for us with energy efficiency.
Well, I would just say finally, what I mentioned earlier on that there's much more attention to distributed energy resources at low voltages on the grid, both in front of the meter and behind the meter. And states right now, New York in particular, and others are experimenting with how to better integrate those distributed resources, including energy efficiency, price them by location and by time. And I think that you're going to need to have more effort on how all of this is going to play out from a regulatory perspective. How do you price different distributed energy resources? Who's allowed to build and operate? Who's going to serve as the platform provider, to use the language from the New York Rev, right? The distribution system platform provider. So I think what will ultimately spur more efficiency as part of a broader range of distributed energy resources is figuring out the regulatory model surrounding DERs on the grid.
That important but not well understood issue of regulation, how to do it better. So all the pressures on NARUC and on Bronco. Well, with that, everybody, thank you all for coming. Thank you to our panelists.
Thank you.
And thank you for coming to the Atlantic Council.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much.